Hello there, my sleepy citizens. Tonight, we journey into the shadowed streets of Gotham City, where mysteries lurk and the Dark Knight stands vigilant against the forces of chaos. We bring you tales of Batman, uncovering different sides of the man behind the mask. And as our journey through these stories winds down, a calm ambience of Gotham's streets will carry you throughout the night, bringing you to restful sleep without interruptions from any ads. If you enjoy these tales, please be sure to give us a like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what story you'd like to hear next. But for now, let's get cozy and step into the world of Gotham. The first reports came from Robinson Park at dawn, joggers speaking of impossible beauty, their voices carrying the same dreamy cadence as those emerging from fever dreams. By midday, the park's familiar pathways had vanished beneath carpets of luminescent moss and flowering vines that seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm. Batman stood at the park's eastern entrance as evening approached, watching tendrils of bioluminescent pollen drift through the air like fallen stars. The transformation happened overnight. Oracle's voice came softly through his cowl. Satellite imagery shows the affected area expanding by roughly 50 meters every hour. Whatever's causing this, it's accelerating. The park before him barely resembled the familiar green space that had served Gotham's families for generations. Ancient oaks now wore crowns of orchids that bloomed in impossible colors, their petals shifting through spectrums that seemed to exist beyond normal perception. Pathways that once led to playgrounds and picnic areas now wound through groves of plants that Alfred's botanical databases couldn't identify, species that appeared to combine characteristics from multiple continents, multiple evolutionary timelines. Temperatures steady at 72 degrees throughout the affected zone. Lucius Fox's voice joined the communication. Humidity's optimal for tropical growth, but there's no weather system causing it. The plants are creating their own microclimate. Batman activated his cowl's atmospheric analysis systems, studying the air currents that carried the strange pollen. Each mote seemed to glow with its own inner light, creating patterns that were almost hypnotic in their complexity. Any word from the people who went in earlier? That's where it gets concerning, Oracle replied. 17 visitors entered the affected area today. 7 emerged on their own, reporting the most peaceful experience of their lives. The other 10, her pause carried worry. They're still inside. Emergency services can see them on thermal imaging, sitting motionless among the flowers, apparently unharmed but completely unresponsive. The entrance to Robinson Park had been cordoned off by GCPD, but Batman could see gaps in their perimeter where the expanding vegetation had already begun to breach the boundaries. Vines crept along sidewalks with purposeful determination, and flowering shrubs pushed through cracks in the concrete with impossible speed. The transformation wasn't random. It followed patterns that suggested intelligence, intention. Alfred, Batman subvocalized. Pull up everything we have on exotic botanical research in Gotham. Focus on anything connected to consciousness alteration or psychoactive plant compounds. Oh, certainly, Master Bruce. Alfred's voice carried its usual calm professionalism, though Batman detected an undercurrent of concern. I should mention that Master Thomas kept extensive journals on botanical research. Some of his work involved experimental greenhouses on the Wayne property, facilities that were sealed after the accident. Batman felt a familiar tightness in his chest at the mention of his father. Thomas Wayne's scientific interests had been wide-reaching, including research that Bruce had never fully explored. Send me the relevant files, and Alfred, prepare the botanical analysis equipment in the cave. We may need to identify species that don't officially exist. As he moved closer to the park's transformed landscape, Batman noticed how the air itself seemed to shimmer with barely visible particles. His cowl's filters were working overtime, but trace amounts of unknown compounds were still reaching his respiratory system. Already he could feel a subtle shift in his perception. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds carried emotional undertones that hadn't been there moments before. Batman? A new voice crackled through his communication system. Detective Harvey Bullock, stationed at the GCPD perimeter. We've got Professor Elena Vasquez here. Says she needs to speak with you urgently. Something about her former student. Batman recognized the name immediately. Elena Vasquez had been one of Gotham University's most respected botanists until a lab accident 3 years ago left her wheelchair-bound and ended her active research career. Her former student had been Pamela Isley, before Isley's transformation into the eco-terrorist known as Poison Ivy. Send her through, Batman replied, watching as an officer wheeled Professor Vasquez toward his position. Even at a distance, he could see the woman's distress. Her usually precise appearance disheveled, her hands trembling as she clutched a leather portfolio. Batman, she called as she approached, her voice carrying decades of academic authority mixed with genuine fear. This is my fault, all of it. I should have destroyed the research years ago, but I thought it might help us understand what happened to Pamela. She opened her portfolio, revealing pages covered with detailed botanical sketches and chemical formulas. These are Pamela's original research notes, from before her transformation. She was working on something she called the neural garden, a theoretical ecosystem that could interface directly with human consciousness. Batman studied the sketches, his enhanced vision capturing details that spoke of brilliant scientific minds pushed beyond ethical boundaries. The plants in Robinson Park match these drawings. Not exactly, Professor Vasquez corrected, her academic precision intact despite her emotional state. These are evolved versions, more sophisticated than anything Pamela originally envisioned. She's had years to refine the concept. She pointed to a particular diagram showing root systems that formed geometric patterns. The neural networks she's created aren't just affecting individual plants. They're forming a collective intelligence. Oracle's voice cut through the explanation. Batman, the expansion rate just doubled. We're looking at the entire downtown area being affected within 24 hours if this continues. Professor Vasquez's face went pale. She's not trying to attack Gotham, she whispered. She's trying to save it. In her mind, humanity's problems can only be solved by returning to a pre-conscious state, living in harmony with nature without the burden of individual will. A paradise prison, Batman said quietly, understanding the full scope of Ivy's plan. She's creating a garden where people can exist in perfect peace, but only by surrendering their humanity. The professor nodded grimly. The plants release psychoactive compounds that induce a state of blissful surrender. People don't want to leave because they've never felt so content, so free from worry or pain, but they're not truly alive anymore. They're just existing. Batman turned his attention back to the transformed park, where bioluminescent flowers swayed in patterns that seemed to beckon him forward. Even through his cowl's filters, he could feel the subtle pull of whatever compounds were saturating the air, the promise of peace, of rest from the endless weight of his mission, whispered at the edges of his consciousness. Oracle, I'm going in, he announced, his voice steady despite the growing influence of Ivy's creation. Monitor my vital signs and keep communication open. If I don't respond within 2 hours, implement Containment Protocol 7. Batman, wait. Professor Vasquez reached out toward him. There's something else you need to know. The neural network isn't just local. Pamela's been preparing for this for months, maybe years. She's connected this garden to root systems throughout the city. Every park, every tree-lined street, every rooftop garden, they're all potential expansion points. Then we stop her here, Batman replied, stepping toward the luminescent boundary where normal reality gave way to Ivy's transformed realm before it spreads any further. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world changed in ways that his rational mind struggled to process. The air became thick with the scent of impossible flowers, jasmine mixed with something that smelled like childhood memories, roses that carried the essence of laughter. Gravity seemed less insistent, and each step sent ripples of bioluminescence through the moss beneath his feet. Vital signs showing elevated serotonin and reduced cortisol, Oracle reported, her voice now seeming to come from very far away. The psychoactive compounds are affecting your brain chemistry despite the filtration. Batman forced himself to focus on the mission, though focusing itself was becoming increasingly difficult. The plants around him weren't just beautiful, they were perfect, each leaf and petal arranged in harmony that his aesthetic sense found deeply satisfying. This was how nature was meant to exist, his mind whispered, free from human interference, allowed to achieve its full potential. A path of luminescent stepping stones led deeper into the garden, and Batman found himself following it almost without conscious decision. Each step brought new wonders, trees that sang in harmonies that resonated in his bones, flowers that opened as he approached to reveal centers that sparkled like captured starlight. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear other voices, soft with contentment, speaking in dreamy murmurs about the peace they had found. Master Bruce, Alfred's voice cut through the growing euphoria, sharp with concern. Your biometrics are showing signs of compromised decision-making. I'm reading elevated dopamine levels and decreased activity in your prefrontal cortex. The reminder of Alfred's presence helped Batman regain some clarity. He activated his cowl's enhanced analytical mode, forcing himself to see past the garden's seductive beauty to understand its true structure. The path he was following wasn't random. It led toward a central point where the bioluminescence was brightest, where the very air seemed to pulse with life. The neural network has a hub, he reported, his voice slightly slurred despite his efforts at professional precision. Everything's connected to a central consciousness. As he moved deeper into the garden, Batman began to see the people who had entered before him. They sat among the flowers in poses of perfect relaxation, their faces serene but empty of the spark that defined human consciousness. They weren't dead, but they weren't truly alive either, existing in a state of perfect contentment that required no thought, no will, no individual identity. They looked so peaceful, Batman found himself thinking, and had to shake his head vigorously to dispel the dangerous thought. This wasn't peace, it was surrender, the abdication of everything that made humanity worth protecting. The path led to a clearing where the impossible had become manifest, a greenhouse that couldn't exist, constructed entirely from living plants that had grown into walls of transparent leaves and flowering panels. Inside, he could glimpse a figure, moving with fluid grace among botanical wonders that defied every law of nature he understood. "Pamela," he called, his voice carrying across the impossible space. The figure turned, and Poison Ivy stepped into view. But this wasn't the eco-terrorist he had faced before. Her plant hybrid physiology had evolved, becoming something more beautiful and more alien than ever before. Her skin held the luminescence of the flowers around her, and her hair moved with the slow grace of underwater plants. She was becoming the garden, or perhaps the garden was becoming her. "Bruce," she said, her voice carrying the rustling whisper of wind through leaves. "You've come to see what I've created. Isn't it beautiful? Isn't it perfect?" Batman forced himself to resist the hypnotic quality of her voice, though part of him wanted nothing more than to agree, to sink into the peaceful embrace of her garden paradise. "You're stealing their humanity, Pamela. These people aren't living, they're just existing." Ivy's expression showed genuine confusion, as if the concept of individual consciousness was difficult for her to grasp. "They're free, Bruce. Free from anger, from fear, from the constant struggle that defines human existence. I've given them peace." "Peace without choice isn't peace," Batman replied, though his conviction wavered as the garden's influence continued to seep into his mind. "It's death of the spirit. Look around you," Ivy gestured to the wonders surrounding them. "This is what the world could be. A place where every living thing exists in harmony, where suffering is impossible because individual will doesn't create conflict." She stepped closer, and Batman caught the full force of her pheromones, compounds that spoke directly to his brain's reward centers. "You could stay, Bruce. You could finally rest from your crusade. The city would be safe because everyone would be content." The offer was seductive beyond reason. Batman's mind, always burdened with the weight of Gotham's problems, began to imagine what it would feel like to simply stop. To exist in perfect tranquility, free from the memories that drove him, free from the responsibility that defined him. Images began to surface. His parents, alive and laughing in a garden much like this one. Thomas Wayne's gentle hands showing young Bruce the names of flowers. Martha Wayne's smile as she arranged fresh blooms. In Ivy's realm, those memories could be more than memories. They could be eternal presence, an endless loop of perfect moments, unmarred by tragedy. "Master Bruce," Alfred's voice cut through the seductive visions, transmitted directly to his auditory cortex through the cowl's bone conduction system. "Remember why you wear the mask. Remember what you protect." The reminder helped Batman shake off some of the garden's influence, though the effort required all his considerable willpower. "Oracle, analysis on the root system structure. How deep does this network extend?" "Scanning now," she replied, though her voice seemed to come from another dimension entirely. "The roots extend. Oh God, Bruce. They're connected to the city's entire underground infrastructure. Every water main, every subway tunnel, every foundation. She's turned Gotham into a single living organism." Ivy smiled at his realization, her expression holding the patience of geological time. "The city was already dying, Bruce. Choked by pollution, corrupted by human greed and violence. I'm not destroying Gotham. I'm healing it, transforming it into something that can truly live." Batman activated his cowl's deepest analysis protocols, pushing through the psychoactive haze to understand the true scope of what Ivy had created. The neural network she described wasn't just affecting Robinson Park. It was a city-wide web of consciousness that could potentially influence every person in Gotham. The people sitting peacefully among the flowers weren't victims of a single encounter. They were the first converts in a transformation that could encompass millions. "Lucius," he sub-vocalized, hoping his communication system could still reach beyond the garden's influence. "The pollen distribution patterns, do they match the underground root network?" "Affirmative," came Fox's reply, distorted but still clear. "The spores are being distributed through the subway system's air circulation. At current expansion rates, We're looking at citywide exposure within 18 hours. The magnitude of the threat helped Batman focus past the garden's seductive pull. This wasn't just about saving the people already trapped. It was about preventing the transformation of everyone he had sworn to protect. But fighting Ivy here, in the heart of her neural garden, felt like trying to punch smoke. Her consciousness was distributed throughout the plant network, and destroying any single component would only slow her down temporarily. There has to be a way to reverse this, he said, though speaking required enormous effort as the psychoactive compounds continued to build in his system. Ivy's expression showed something that might have been pity. Why would you want to reverse paradise, Bruce? Look at them, she gestured to the peaceful figures scattered throughout the garden. When have you ever seen humans look so content? When have you ever seen a world without violence, without suffering? Batman looked, and for a moment allowed himself to truly see what Ivy had created. The people among the flowers weren't just peaceful. They were radiant with a contentment that he had never witnessed in all his years protecting Gotham. Their faces held the serene joy of those who had found perfect acceptance, perfect unity with their environment. The sight awakened a longing in him that ran deeper than rational thought. How many nights had he spent fighting against the darkness of human nature? How many times had he witnessed the cruelty that people inflicted on each other? Ivy's garden offered an end to all of that, not through justice or redemption, but through the simple elimination of the individual will that made such cruelty possible. "Alfred," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself, "I need you to remind me why we fight." Alfred's response came through not just the communication system, but through memories that the garden's influence couldn't completely suppress. Young Bruce being taught to tend the Wayne family's rose garden, learning that beauty required both cultivation and pruning. Alfred's patient lessons about responsibility, about the weight that came with privilege, about the importance of choosing to do what was right, even when it was difficult. "We fight, Master Bruce," Alfred's voice carried across impossible distances, "because choice is what makes us human, because peace without the possibility of struggle is not peace at all. It is the end of growth, the end of hope, the end of everything that makes life meaningful." The reminder helped Batman push back against the garden's influence. Though the effort left him trembling with exhaustion, there has to be a central node, he realized aloud. Something that maintains the network's coherence. Ivy's expression shifted, showing the first hint of concern he had seen from her. "Bruce, please don't fight this. You of all people deserve rest. Let me give you peace." But Batman was already moving, following the patterns of bioluminescence that pulsed through the garden like a vast circulatory system. The light was brightest at the center of the clearing, where the impossible greenhouse stood, surrounded by flowers that seemed to exist partially in this dimension and partially in some realm of pure botanical consciousness. "The greenhouse," he reported to Oracle, though speaking required pushing through layers of psychoactive haze. "It's not just where she's controlling the network. It's where she's interfacing with it directly." Inside the transparent walls, he could see equipment that combined cutting-edge technology with organic growth. Computers whose circuits were grown rather than manufactured. Monitoring systems that pulsed with the same rhythm as the surrounding plants. And at the center of it all, a chair that was less furniture than living throne. Its surface covered with tendrils that would interface directly with a human nervous system. She's hardwired herself into the network, Batman realized. She's not just controlling the plants, she's become part of them. The implications were staggering. If Ivy had truly merged her consciousness with the botanical network, then stopping her would require more than simple combat or negotiation. It would require understanding the connection itself, finding a way to separate her individual identity from the collective consciousness she had created. Master Bruce, Alfred's voice carried urgent concern. Your vitals are approaching dangerous levels. The psychoactive compounds are beginning to affect your cardiovascular system. You need to either find an antidote or remove yourself from the environment immediately. Batman knew Alfred was right, but he also knew that leaving now would mean abandoning Gotham to Ivy's vision of paradise. The neural network was too established, too widespread to be stopped from outside its influence. The only way to end this was from within, by somehow reaching the individual consciousness that Pamela Isley had once been. He approached the greenhouse, each step requiring more willpower than the last. The plants around him had begun to respond to his presence, flowers turning to track his movement, vines rustling with what sounded almost like whispered conversation. The garden knew he represented a threat to its perfect harmony, but it couldn't attack him directly. That would violate the very peace it was created to maintain. Pamela, he called as he reached the greenhouse walls, I want to understand what you've created. Show me how it works. Ivy appeared beside him with the fluid grace of growing plants. Her movements so natural it seemed like time-lapse photography of blooming flowers. You really want to see? She asked, her voice carrying genuine hope. You want to understand the beauty of what we could become? Batman nodded, though the gesture felt like moving through thick honey. The psychoactive compounds had reached levels that made complex thought nearly impossible, but he held onto his core mission through sheer force of will. Ivy gestured, and the greenhouse walls became permeable, allowing them to step inside without opening any visible door. The interior defied spatial logic, vast enough to contain impossible gardens, yet intimate enough to feel like a private sanctuary. Plants from every ecosystem on Earth grew in perfect harmony, their needs somehow balanced by the network's collective intelligence. This is what I was trying to create in my research, Ivy explained, her voice full of wonder at her own achievement. A closed ecosystem where every component supports every other component. No competition, no conflict, no death. Just endless, sustainable growth. At the center of the greenhouse stood the living throne Batman had glimpsed from outside. Up close, he could see that it was more than a chair. It was an interface point where human consciousness could merge with the botanical network. Thousands of hair-thin tendrils emerged from its surface, ready to make neural connections that would link an individual mind to the collective intelligence. This is how I maintain the network, Ivy explained, settling into the throne with obvious relief. The tendrils immediately connected with her nervous system, and her expression became even more serene. Through me, every plant in the network can access human intelligence. Through the network, I can experience the peace of pure botanical existence. Batman watched as Ivy's consciousness expanded to encompass the entire garden. Her awareness touched every flower, every root, every person sitting in peaceful surrender among the impossible plants. For a moment, he glimpsed what she experienced, a vast, interconnected web of life where every component existed in perfect harmony. The vision was seductive beyond measure. In Ivy's network there was no loneliness, no individual suffering, no tragic memories that haunted quiet moments. There was only the endless cycle of growth and renewal, consciousness without the burden of individual identity. You could join us, Bruce, Ivy said, though her voice now seemed to come from every plant in the greenhouse simultaneously. The network can support another consciousness. You could help guide humanity into this new form of existence. Batman felt the offer pull at every part of his psyche that craved peace, that yearned for an end to the endless struggle against Gotham's darkness. The throne beside Ivy's had space for him, its tendrils already reaching toward him with gentle invitation. Oracle, he subvocalized, though forming the words required tremendous effort. Status on the citywide network. Expansion has accelerated, came her reply, distorted by distance and the garden's influence. Preliminary reports of euphoric episodes in 7 different neighborhoods. We're approaching the tipping point. The reminder of his responsibility helped Batman resist the throne's invitation, though the effort left him swaying on his feet. Pamela, what happens to individual choice in your network? What happens to human growth, to the possibility of change? Ivy's expression showed confusion, as if the concepts he was describing had become foreign to her merged consciousness. Growth happens constantly in the network, Bruce. Every moment brings new connections, new harmonies. Change is the fundamental nature of life. But not individual change, Batman pressed, forcing his drugged mind to articulate the distinction. Not the kind of change that comes from choosing to be better than you were, from struggling against your limitations. Your network eliminates the possibility of individual growth by eliminating individual consciousness. For the first time since entering the garden, Batman saw uncertainty flicker across Ivy's features. Individual consciousness creates suffering, she said, though the statement sounded less certain than before. Competition, conflict, the cruelty that humans inflict on each other and on the natural world. It also creates love, Batman replied, drawing on memories that the psychoactive compounds couldn't quite suppress. Real love, chosen freely despite all the risks it brings. It creates art, creates the possibility of sacrifice, creates every moment of genuine beauty that humans have ever achieved. Ivy's connection to the network seemed to waver slightly, and Batman felt some of the garden's oppressive influence diminish. Love exists in the network, she insisted. Perfect love without jealousy or loss. Love without choice isn't love, Batman said, echoing Alfred's earlier wisdom. Existence, existence. And existence without the possibility of loss isn't life, it's stagnation. The greenhouse around them began to shift, its perfect harmony showing subtle signs of discord. Plants that had grown in impossible combinations started to separate, their individual natures reasserting themselves against the network's forced unity. "You're destroying it," Ivy said, her voice carrying genuine anguish. "You're bringing chaos back to paradise." "I'm bringing choice back to paradise," Batman corrected. "The choice to stay or leave, to grow or remain static, to love or exist in safety." He could see the network beginning to destabilize as Ivy's absolute certainty wavered. The people sitting among the flowers started to show signs of returning awareness, their peaceful expressions flickering with confusion and growing consciousness. Alfred, Batman, subvocalized, "Prepare medical teams for mass psychoactive exposure. We're going to have a lot of people who need help readjusting to individual consciousness." "Already prepared, Master Bruce," Alfred replied, his voice carrying relief. "Professor Vasquez has been working with Dr. Tompkins to develop treatments for the psychoactive compounds." Ivy rose from her throne, the tendrils disconnecting with obvious reluctance. "You don't understand what you're doing, Bruce. Without the network, they'll return to all the pain and conflict they escaped. They'll suffer. They'll live," Batman replied. "Really live, with all the joy and sorrow that entails. They'll have the chance to choose their own version of happiness, instead of accepting the one you've imposed on them." The greenhouse was dissolving around them, its impossible architecture returning to more mundane botanical reality. The network's influence was fading, As Ivy's absolute conviction crumbled, and Batman felt his own mind clearing as the psychoactive compounds were metabolized and filtered out of his system. "The network is collapsing," Oracle reported, her voice suddenly crystal clear. "Pollen levels dropping rapidly throughout the affected areas. Whatever you did, it's working." Batman watched as Ivy stood among the dissolving remains of her perfect garden, her expression cycling through loss, confusion, and something that might have been relief. "I was trying to save them," she said quietly. "I was trying to save everyone." "I know," Batman replied, his voice gentle despite everything that had happened. "But salvation has to be chosen, Pamela. It can't be imposed, no matter how beautiful the prison." Around them, Robinson Park was returning to its normal state. The impossible flowers were fading, the luminescent moss dimming to ordinary green. People throughout the garden were stirring from their peaceful surrender, their individual consciousness reasserting itself against the fading influence of the neural network. As Batman prepared to escort Ivy into custody, she turned to him with an expression of genuine curiosity. "Do you ever wonder if you made the right choice, Bruce? Do you ever think about how much simpler it would be to just stop fighting?" Batman considered the question seriously, remembering the seductive peace he had felt in her garden paradise. "Every day," he admitted. "But that's what makes the choice meaningful. That's what makes the fight worth fighting." As medical teams moved through the park to help those recovering from the network's influence, Batman reflected on what Ivy had almost accomplished. Her vision of paradise hadn't been entirely wrong. There was genuine beauty in the harmony she had created. Real peace in the surrender she offered, but peace without choice was indeed a form of death, and beauty without the possibility of struggle was ultimately meaningless. The city's lights stretched out below them as they left Robinson Park, each light representing an individual consciousness choosing its own path through the darkness. It wasn't the perfect harmony of Ivy's network, but it was something more precious. The messy, chaotic, ultimately hopeful reality of human beings choosing to grow, to change, to love, despite all the risks those choices entailed. In the days that followed, Gotham slowly recovered from its brush with botanical paradise. Professor Vasquez worked with city officials to identify and treat the network's remaining influence, while Lucius Fox developed new monitoring systems to detect similar large-scale psychoactive attacks. Alfred tended the Wayne Manor gardens with his usual care, though Bruce noticed he spent extra time ensuring each plant maintained its individual character rather than growing in perfect harmony. And in the depths of Arkham Asylum, Pamela Isley sat in a cell, surrounded by carefully monitored plant life, her expression cycling between the memory of perfect unity and the slow, difficult process of rediscovering individual consciousness. Sometimes she wondered if Batman had been right to destroy her network, and sometimes she mourned the paradise she had briefly created. But increasingly she found herself curious about what individual growth might look like, what choices she might make if given the chance to choose freely once again. Batman's final visit to Robinson Park came a week after the incident, as the last traces of the neural network faded from the soil. The park looked almost normal again, though careful observers might notice that the flowers seemed slightly more vibrant, the trees slightly more graceful than before. Some of Ivy's influence would always remain, not as a network of imposed harmony, but as a reminder that beauty and consciousness could coexist without one dominating the other. Standing among the ordinary flowers in the ordinary moonlight, Batman reflected on the nature of paradise and the price of peace. Ivy's garden had offered genuine serenity, real freedom from suffering, but it had demanded the surrender of everything that made that peace meaningful. Choice, growth, the possibility of individual love and loss. Master Bruce, Alfred's voice came through the cowl, carrying the warmth that had anchored him through decades of darkness. How are you feeling? The medical analysis shows traces of the psychoactive compounds will remain in your system for several more days. Batman breathed deeply, testing his perceptions against the memory of Ivy's influence. Different, he admitted. The experience, it showed me something about myself I hadn't expected. And what was that, sir? How much I've been carrying alone, Batman replied quietly. In her network, the weight of protecting Gotham was distributed among every consciousness. For a moment, I felt what it would be like to share that burden completely. Alfred's pause carried understanding. But sharing the burden completely would mean sharing the choice to carry it, wouldn't it? And that choice, that individual decision to protect others, is what makes the burden meaningful. Exactly. Batman moved through the park's restored pathways, noting how the remaining traces of Ivy's influence had settled into patterns that enhanced rather than overwhelmed the natural ecosystem. The network offered peace, but it was the peace of surrender. What we do here, what you and I choose to do together, is the peace of purpose. Oracle's voice joined the conversation. Speaking of purpose, we've got reports coming in from the people who were affected by the network. The psychological evaluations are interesting. How so? Most of them describe the experience as transformative, but not in the way Ivy intended. They talk about understanding their individual consciousness more clearly because they experienced what it was like to lose it. Several have started therapy, others have made major life changes. It's like the network gave them perspective on their own agency. Batman found this revelation both surprising and deeply satisfying. They chose to grow from the experience. Which brings up another point, Oracle continued. Professor Vasquez wants to meet with you again. She's been analyzing tissue samples from the network's root system, and she's discovered something significant about Ivy's condition. The meeting took place 2 days later in the secure botanical laboratory that Lucius Fox had established in a subsidiary of Wayne Enterprises. Professor Vasquez wheeled herself between tables covered with plant specimens that glowed faintly with residual bioluminescence, her scientific excitement overriding the guilt that had driven her during the crisis. "Look at this," she said, indicating a microscopic image on her computer screen. "These are cellular samples from the network's primary nodes. Notice the unusual protein structures?" Batman studied the image, his cowl's analysis comparing it against thousands of known botanical specimens. The cells show signs of hybrid development, part plant, part human. Exactly. But here's what's fascinating. The transformation isn't stable. The network wasn't just changing other people's consciousness, it was completing Pamela's own transformation in ways she didn't understand. Professor Vasquez switched to another image, showing cellular degradation. Without the network to support her hybrid physiology, she's reverting to a more human baseline. Which means her connection to plant consciousness is weakening. For the first time since her original transformation, she's becoming primarily human again. The professor's expression carried hope mixed with scientific caution. It might be possible to complete the reversion, to give her back her original human consciousness, while retaining some of her botanical knowledge. Batman considered the implications. Have you discussed this with her? That's why I wanted to speak with you first. The process would require her willing participation, and given her current mental state, Professor Vasquez trailed off, her meaning clear. She might not want to give up her connection to the plant world, Batman finished. Even after the network's collapse, it's still part of who she's become. The conversation with Ivy took place in Arkham's maximum security botanical wing, where her cell had been designed to accommodate her unique physiology while preventing any possibility of plant-based escape. She sat surrounded by carefully monitored flowers, her appearance noticeably more human than it had been during the network incident. "You look different," Batman observed, settling into the chair across from her containment area. Ivy's smile carried a wistfulness that seemed entirely human. "I feel different. The network's collapse left me disconnected. For years, I could sense every plant in Gotham, feel their growth and seasonal changes as part of my own consciousness. Now, there's just silence. Do you miss it? The connection, yes. The certainty it provided? Sometimes." Ivy turned her attention to a small orchid growing beside her chair, its blooms a natural purple rather than the impossible colors her network had produced. "But I'm also experiencing something I hadn't felt in years. Curiosity about what I might become rather than what I already am." Batman leaned forward slightly. "Professor Vasquez believes your transformation might be reversible, that you could choose to become primarily human again while retaining your botanical knowledge." Ivy's expression cycled through surprise, fear, and something that might have been hope. "Human again? After everything I've done? Everything I've become?" "The choice would be yours," Batman emphasized. "No one would force the change on you, but it would be a choice, the kind of individual decision your network made impossible." For several minutes, Ivy sat in contemplative silence, her fingers absently stroking the orchid's petals. "I created the network because I believed individual consciousness was the source of all suffering," she said finally. "But in these past few days, experiencing my own individual thoughts again, there's beauty in the uncertainty, isn't there? In not knowing what I might choose to do next." "That's what makes choice meaningful," Batman agreed. "The possibility of surprise, even to yourself." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Joan Leland, Arkham's chief psychiatrist, carrying a tablet displaying psychological evaluation results. "Pamela, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I wanted to share some findings with both of you." "Of course, Doctor," Ivy replied, her tone carrying genuine warmth that hadn't been present during her network phase. Dr. Leland activated her tablet's display. "We've been monitoring your brain activity since the network's collapse, and the results are remarkable. Your neural patterns are showing increased activity in areas associated with individual identity formation and empathy toward other individuals rather than collective consciousness." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Batman asked. "It means that Pamela's capacity for individual moral reasoning is returning," Dr. Leland explained. "The network suppressed those neural pathways in favor of collective harmony, but they're reactivating now that she's disconnected." Ivy's expression showed wonder at her own changing consciousness. "I can feel it happening. When I think about the people who were affected by my network, I feel guilt. Individual guilt for individual harm, rather than the abstract regret of disturbing collective harmony. Guilt can be constructive," Batman offered. "It's what motivates people to make amends, to choose differently in the future." "Is that what drives you?" Ivy asked. "Individual guilt over what happened to your parents?" Batman considered the question carefully. "Partly, But more than guilt, it's the choice to ensure that others don't experience the same loss. The network would have eliminated that choice by eliminating the possibility of loss itself. Dr. Leland made notes on her tablet. This conversation is actually therapeutic for Pamela's reintegration process. Discussing individual choice and moral reasoning helps strengthen those neural pathways. Over the following weeks, Batman found himself making regular visits to Arkham, not as an interrogator or adversary, but as someone uniquely qualified to understand the weight of individual choice in the face of overwhelming responsibility. Ivy's transformation back toward humanity was gradual but steady, marked by increasing complexity in her emotional responses and growing awareness of herself as an individual rather than part of a collective consciousness. "I've been thinking about the people in my network," she said during one visit, her voice carrying a sorrow that was entirely personal. "They trusted me to care for them, and I took away the very thing that made them themselves. But they chose to enter the network initially," Batman pointed out. "They were seeking something, peace, escape from individual suffering. Your methods were wrong, but their need was real." Ivy nodded slowly. "That's what Professor Vasquez has been helping me understand. The desire to eliminate suffering is admirable, but eliminating the consciousness that experiences suffering isn't the same as eliminating suffering itself." "What do you think would be a better approach?" "I don't know yet," Ivy admitted, and Batman could hear the uncertainty that marked returning individual consciousness. "But I think maybe helping people strengthen their individual ability to cope with suffering rather than trying to eliminate their individuality entirely." The conversation was interrupted by Alfred's voice through Batman's cowl. "Master Bruce, I apologize for the interruption, but we have a situation developing in Robinson Park. Early reports suggest some of the network's root systems have reactivated." Batman's expression sharpened with concern, but Ivy looked genuinely puzzled. "That's not possible. When the network collapsed, I felt every connection sever. There shouldn't be any active nodes left." "Oracle, what are we looking at?" Batman sub-vocalized. "Preliminary scans show bioluminescent activity in the park's southeast section, but it's different from before. The patterns are chaotic, uncontrolled, more like plant life trying to reconnect to something that's no longer there." Dr. Leland looked between Batman and Ivy with professional concern. This could be dangerous for Pamela's recovery process, if there are still active elements of her network consciousness. "No," Ivy said firmly, her voice carrying conviction that surprised everyone in the room. "If part of the network is still active, it's operating without guidance, without the consciousness that gave it purpose. It would be like a body trying to function without a brain." Batman understood immediately. Dangerous because it's uncontrolled, not because it's following a plan. Exactly. The network was stable because every element was connected to every other element through my consciousness. Without that central coordination, Ivy trailed off, her expression showing fear for the first time since her capture. "It could grow wildly, consuming everything in its path without the restraint that conscious control provided," Batman finished. Within the hour, Batman found himself back in Robinson Park, this time accompanied by Ivy under heavy guard and Professor Vasquez's mobile laboratory unit. The affected area was smaller than during the original incident, but the plant growth was more aggressive, more chaotic. Vines wrapped around trees with crushing force, flowers bloomed and died in rapid cycles, and the bioluminescence flickered erratically like a broken electrical system. "In pain," Ivy said softly, her voice carrying empathy that was entirely human. "The network fragments are trying to reconnect, but they don't have the consciousness needed to form stable connections." Professor Vasquez monitored readings from her mobile equipment. "The chemical emissions are wildly unstable. Instead of the controlled psychoactive compounds from before, we're seeing random combinations that could be toxic. Can you reconnect with it? Batman asked Ivy. Provide the guidance it needs to stabilize? Ivy's expression showed genuine fear. I could try, but reconnecting to the network might undo all the progress I'd made toward individual consciousness. I might lose myself again. Batman understood the weight of what he was asking. The choice is yours, Pamela. No one can make it for you. For several long moments, Ivy stood at the edge of the chaotic garden, watching plant life destroy itself in its desperate attempt to reconnect to the consciousness it had lost. Then, with visible effort, she stepped forward into the affected area. I won't reconnect completely, she said, her voice steady with decision, but I can provide enough guidance to help the fragments find stability on their own. What followed was unlike anything Batman had witnessed before. Ivy moved through the chaotic garden with careful precision, touching plants that were destroying themselves in their confusion, speaking to them in a language that was part human words, part chemical communication. Gradually, the frantic growth slowed, the erratic bioluminescence steadied into gentle patterns. She's teaching them to exist independently, Professor Vasquez observed with scientific wonder. Instead of creating a new network, she's helping each plant group develop its own stable consciousness. Batman watched as Ivy completed her work, noting how she maintained her individual identity throughout the process. Instead of merging with the plant consciousness as she had done before, she remained distinctly human while providing the guidance the fragments needed. It's finished, she announced, stepping back from the now peaceful garden. They'll be stable now, able to grow without the network's support. And you? Batman asked. How do you feel? Ivy considered the question carefully. Different. I helped them without losing myself in the process. It felt like teaching, rather than controlling. Dr. Leland, who had been monitoring Ivy's vital signs throughout the process, looked up from her readings with evident satisfaction. Her neural patterns remained stable throughout. She maintained individual consciousness while providing assistance to other forms of consciousness. That's a remarkable demonstration of psychological integration. In the weeks that followed, Ivy continued her recovery under Dr. Leland's care, while the stabilized garden fragments in Robinson Park became a unique ecosystem, plants that retained some of their enhanced capabilities without the controlling network consciousness. Visitors to the park reported feelings of calm and connection to nature, but without the overwhelming compulsion to surrender their individual identity. It's like she found a middle path, Oracle observed during one of Batman's reports, between the isolation of pure individuality and the dissolution of network consciousness. Batman agreed, finding something hopeful in Ivy's journey back to humanity. She learned that helping others doesn't require eliminating yourself, and that individual consciousness doesn't have to mean individual isolation. The final chapter of the incident came months later, when Ivy was granted supervised release to work with Professor Vasquez on legitimate botanical research. Their first project focused on developing plants that could help people with psychological trauma, not by eliminating their individual consciousness, but by providing natural environments that supported individual healing and growth. I understand now what I was trying to do wrong before, Ivy explained during their first public presentation of the research. I was trying to eliminate suffering by eliminating the consciousness that experiences it. But consciousness, individual consciousness, isn't the problem. It's the solution. It's what allows us to recognize suffering, to choose to help alleviate it, and to grow from the experience of both causing and healing harm. Batman attended the presentation from the shadows, watching as Ivy demonstrated how plants could be cultivated to support human psychological well-being without compromising human agency. Her work showed the possibility of harmony between human consciousness and natural systems, not through the surrender of one to the other, but through mutual respect and understanding. As he prepared to leave, Batman reflected on what Ivy's journey had taught him about his own mission, the choice to protect Gotham, to carry the weight of individual responsibility for others' welfare, was meaningful precisely because it was chosen freely. Any system that eliminated that choice, whether through Ivy's network consciousness or through more conventional forms of control, ultimately diminished the very humanity it claimed to protect. The night air carried the scent of Ivy's stabilized gardens, while plants grew in individual beauty while maintaining connection to their environment. In that balance between independence and interdependence, Batman found a metaphor for what he tried to achieve in his work, protecting individual choice while fostering the connections that made community possible. Standing among the ordinary flowers in the ordinary moonlight, Batman reflected on the nature of paradise and the price of peace. Ivy's garden had offered genuine serenity, real freedom from suffering, but it had demanded the surrender of everything that made that peace meaningful: choice, growth, the possibility of individual love and loss. As he prepared to return to his patrol of Gotham's darker corners, Batman carried with him the memory of perfect botanical harmony and the knowledge that he had chosen correctly in rejecting it. The city's chaos, its endless potential for both cruelty and kindness, remained infinitely more valuable than any imposed paradise. The night air carried the scent of ordinary flowers, each bloom choosing its own time to open, its own way to meet the darkness. In that simple, chaotic beauty, Batman found a peace more profound than anything Ivy's network could have provided. The peace that came from protecting not just life, but the freedom to choose how that life was lived. The night air carried the scent of ordinary flowers, each bloom choosing its own time to open, its own way to meet the darkness. In that simple, chaotic beauty, Batman found a peace more profound than anything Ivy's network could have provided. The peace that came from protecting not just life, but the freedom to choose how that life was lived. As he swung away from Robinson Park, the memory of botanical harmony still fresh in his mind, Batman's cowl picked up an unusual silence, cutting through Gotham's typical nighttime symphony. The absence of sound was as striking as any alarm. Somewhere in the city, even the ambient noise of urban life had been swallowed by an unnatural quiet. "Oracle," he subvocalized. "I'm detecting an acoustic anomaly in the cathedral district. What's the status on St. Bartholomew's bell tower?" "That odd," came her reply, accompanied by the sound of rapid typing. "The tower's automated bell system should have chimed midnight 3 minutes ago. But I'm not reading any mechanical failures, and the power grid in that area is stable." Batman altered his trajectory toward the cathedral district, where Gothic spires pierced Gotham's skyline like ancient prayers made manifest in stone. The contrast between the living, breathing garden he had just left and the eternal stillness of sacred architecture created an unsettling juxtaposition in his mind. Where Ivy's realm had pulsed with overwhelming life, something in the cathedral quarter seemed to have absorbed all sound, all movement, all signs of existence itself. The transition from one silence to another felt like crossing between different kinds of death, from the death of individual will to something far more final, far more absolute. In the distance, St. Bartholomew's bell tower stood dark against the stars, its ancient bells holding their tongues in a silence that seemed to spread like a infection through the surrounding streets. Whatever waited in that tower, Batman knew it represented a different kind of threat than Ivy's seductive paradise. Where her network had offered the peaceful surrender of consciousness, this new silence promised something altogether more permanent. The kind of quiet that only came when all possibility of choice, of growth, of existence itself had been extinguished forever. Rain fell in gentle sheets across Gotham's oldest districts, where centuries-old bell towers rose like silent sentinels above cobblestone streets that remembered different times. The drops tapped a steady rhythm against weathered stone and forgotten brass, creating a symphony of whispers that only the night could hear. From his perch atop the Wayne Foundation building, Batman watched the city's lights flicker and fade in precise patterns, each blackout zone expanding like ink through water before dissolving back into illumination. The third night of the power grid anomalies had brought something worse than darkness. Within each blackout zone, when the lights returned, they revealed what the shadows had hidden. A body, always alone, always marked with the same precise tally marks carved into pale skin. 3 victims so far, each found in locations that seemed random until you understood the deeper geography of Gotham's founding families. The pattern is becoming clearer, Master Bruce. Alfred's voice came through the cowl's communication system, his tone carrying the weight of careful analysis. Each victim was found near properties once owned by the original city planners. The Willoughby Mansion ruins, the old Pemberton Warehouse district, and now the former Blackgate family estate. Batman shifted his position as another section of the city plunged into darkness, this one encompassing the historic Clock Tower district. His enhanced vision tracked the precise boundaries of the outage, too perfect to be accidental, too sophisticated to be random infrastructure failure. Someone was controlling Gotham's power grid with surgical precision, using the city's own electrical nervous system as a weapon. Oracle's analysis of the grid disruptions shows they're being triggered from elevated positions, Alfred continued, his fingers audible against keyboard keys in the cave below. Specifically from transmission points that would give clear sight lines to multiple city blocks. The bell towers, Batman realized, his voice barely disturbing the rain-soaked air. Someone's using the old church towers as command posts. The city's skyline was dotted with dozens of these architectural remnants from an earlier era, when Gotham's spiritual life had centered around grand churches with bells that once called the faithful to prayer across miles of urban landscape. Movement caught his attention in the darkened district below, a figure moving with purpose through streets now lit only by emergency lighting and the occasional flicker of backup generators. Batman launched himself from the building's edge, his cape catching the rain-heavy air as he glided toward the disturbance. The Clock Tower district had been gentrifying slowly, old buildings converted to artists' lofts and boutique businesses, but tonight it felt abandoned, emptied by the sudden darkness. Batman touched down on a fire escape overlooking the main street, rain streaming from his cowl as he scanned for signs of the figure he'd spotted from above. Master Bruce, Alfred's voice carried concern. Commissioner Gordon reports they've lost radio contact with Officer Chen. She was investigating suspicious activity in your current location approximately 15 minutes ago. A scream pierced the night, sharp and brief, coming from the direction of St. Bartholomew's, one of the district's oldest churches, its bell tower rising nearly 200 feet above the surrounding buildings. Batman moved toward the sound, his boots silent on wet pavement, despite his urgency. The church had been abandoned for over a decade, its congregation dwindled to nothing as the neighborhood changed, but the building remained, watched over by a rotating series of caretakers who ensured its architectural integrity, if not its spiritual purpose. He found Officer Chen in the church's side courtyard, pressed against a stone wall with her service weapon drawn but trembling in her grip. She was young, probably fresh from the academy, and her wide eyes tracked movements that Batman couldn't immediately see. "Officer," he said quietly, stepping into her peripheral vision slowly enough not to startle her. "What did you see?" Chen's breath came in sharp gasps, but her voice was steady. "Someone in the bell tower, moving around up there with some kind of equipment. When the lights went out, I came to investigate, but..." She gestured toward the church entrance, where the heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar. "I heard someone counting, over and over, numbers, but in a voice that didn't sound right." "Alfred," Batman sub-vocalized, "scan for thermal signatures in the bell tower." "It's scanning now," came the immediate reply. "Yes, I'm detecting movement approximately 180 feet above street level. Heat signature suggests one individual, but there are electronic devices generating significant thermal output." "Master Bruce, be careful. The positioning gives anyone up there complete tactical advantage." Batman studied the church's exterior, noting the various access points and the condition of the stonework. "Officer Chen, I need you to move to a secure position and call for backup, but keep them at least 2 blocks away until I give the all clear." She nodded, professional training overriding her obvious fear. "Batman, when I heard the counting, it wasn't just numbers. It was like someone keeping score." The observation sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the rain. He'd encountered that kind of methodical counting before, always in connection with a particular kind of madness that reduced human lives to simple arithmetic. As Officer Chen moved away, Batman found a maintenance access at the church's rear and began his ascent through the building's interior. The maintenance passages of St. Bartholomew's revealed the church's age in layers of accumulated history, paint peeled from walls that had been repainted dozens of times over the decades, each layer representing a different era of the congregation's care for their sacred space. Batman moved through narrow corridors lined with forgotten storage rooms filled with Christmas decorations from the 1970s, folding chairs stacked like sleeping giants and boxes of hymnals whose pages had yellowed with decades of faithful use. "Master Bruce," Alfred's voice carried through the communication system. "I'm cross-referencing the power grid anomalies with historical records of Gotham's original church architecture. The pattern is even more sophisticated than we initially thought. Whoever planned this studied not just the locations of the bell towers, but their acoustic properties, their sight lines, and their relationship to the city's electrical infrastructure." Batman paused at a junction where the maintenance corridor split toward different sections of the church. The counting from above had grown slightly louder, suggesting he was getting closer to the source. But there was something else now. A rhythmic electronic beeping that seemed to pulse in counterpoint to the voice reciting numbers. "The electronic signature you're detecting," Alfred continued, "it's not just computers. There are multiple devices generating electromagnetic pulses in specific patterns. Whatever he's doing up there, it's coordinated with equipment at other locations across the city. A network," Batman realized, choosing the corridor that led most directly toward the bell tower. He's not just using the towers as vantage points. He's turned them into nodes in a communication system. The corridor began to incline upward, following the church's architectural transition from ground level to the soaring heights of its bell tower. Through gaps in the stonework, Batman could see glimpses of the main sanctuary below, rows of empty pews facing an altar that still bore fresh flowers, suggesting someone still cared for this abandoned place despite its dwindling congregation. "Master Bruce?" Alfred's tone carried new concern. "I'm detecting similar electronic signatures at 4 other locations now. Whatever network he's established, It's larger than the 3 we initially identified. And there's something else. The electromagnetic pulses aren't random. They're following a mathematical sequence. Batman reached a landing where a narrow window offered a view of Gotham's skyline. In the distance, he could see other bell towers and church spires, many of them dark silhouettes against the storm-heavy sky. But several showed tiny points of light in their upper reaches. Not the warm glow of traditional church lighting, but the cold blue flicker of electronic equipment. "How many locations total?" he asked quietly. "At least 7 confirmed, possibly more. The electronic signatures are sophisticated enough that some could be masked from our detection systems." Alfred's typing was more rapid now, suggesting increased urgency. "Master Bruce, if he's established command posts at 7 or more locations, coordinating simultaneous takedowns becomes exponentially more difficult." The counting from above had grown clearer, and Batman could now make out individual words between the numbers. 38, 39, 40. Another streetwalker who thought the darkness was just inconvenience. 41, 42, 43. The businessman who stayed late because he valued profit over safety. 44. Each number was accompanied by what sounded like a brief biographical sketch, as if Zsasz was keeping detailed records not just of his victims' deaths, but of their lives leading up to those deaths. The methodical nature of it was chilling, not the random violence of opportunity, but carefully researched and catalogued murder. Batman resumed his climb, the maintenance corridor now following the tower's circular staircase. The stone walls bore centuries of carved initials and brief messages left by church caretakers and bell ringers. J.M., 1847. For Mary's soul, may she rest in peace. Storm damage repaired, July, 1923. The tower held the memories of everyone who had ever climbed these stairs in service of the church's mission. "Alfred," he sub-vocalized, "can you access the historical records for St. Bartholomew's? I need to know about previous caretakers, anyone who might have had detailed knowledge of the building's systems." "Checking now," Alfred replied. "The church has been maintained by the same family for over 60 years, the Hendersons, currently under the care of James Henderson, grandson of the original caretaker. But Master Bruce, church records show that several items were stolen from their archives 6 months ago, including detailed architectural plans and maintenance schedules." That explained how Zsasz had gained such intimate knowledge of the building's layout, but it also suggested his planning had been underway for months, possibly longer. This wasn't an improvised crime spree, it was a meticulously orchestrated campaign with specific goals and methodologies. The electronic beeping was growing stronger, mixing with the sound of the continuing count. 47. 48. The nurse who thought compassion could protect her from mathematics. 49, 50. Batman reached the final landing before the bell chamber itself. Through the heavy wooden door ahead, he could see flickering light that suggested multiple computer screens. But he could also hear something else now, a low humming that wasn't quite mechanical. It took him a moment to realize what it was. Zsasz was humming a melody between his counts, something that sounded almost like a hymn. The inside of St. Bartholomew's retained the hushed atmosphere of sacred spaces, even in abandonment. Moonlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across empty pews and a dust-covered altar. But the silence that should have been peaceful carried an underlying tension, broken by soft sounds from high above. Footsteps, the scrape of metal against stone, and yes, barely audible counting. 47, 48, 49. The voice drifted down from the bell tower. flat and emotionless, like someone reciting a shopping list. Batman climbed the narrow spiral staircase that led to the tower, each step bringing the voice into clearer focus. The counting continued, methodical and patient, punctuated by small mechanical sounds that suggested electronic equipment being operated with practiced precision. "Alfred," he whispered, "I need you to trace the power grid disruptions in real time. Someone up here is coordinating the blackouts." "Already on it, Master Bruce. The disruptions are being triggered by remote access to transformer stations, but the commands are coming from your location. Whoever's up there has broken into the city's electrical management system." The staircase opened onto the bell chamber, where massive bronze bells hung silent in their wooden framework. But the counting voice came from higher still, from the tower's uppermost level, where the original bell ringers would have controlled the entire carillon. Batman continued upward, his movements barely disturbing the ancient air. 52, 53, 54. He reached the final platform and found himself facing a figure hunched over multiple laptop computers and electronic devices, all powered by a portable generator that hummed quietly in the corner. The man's back was turned, but Batman recognized the distinctive scarred pattern across his exposed arms and neck, countless tally marks carved into flesh, a grotesque accounting of lives taken. Victor Zsasz had always been Gotham's most methodical killer, treating murder as a form of bookkeeping, where each victim represented a point scored in some incomprehensible game. But this setup suggested something far more elaborate than his usual random strikes. 55, 56. Zsasz continued counting without turning around, his fingers dancing across keyboard keys. "You're earlier than I calculated, Batman. But then again, my math has been getting more interesting lately." "The power grid," Batman said, studying the equipment arrays. "You're using the blackouts to isolate your victims." "Not just isolate," Zsasz replied, finally turning around with that characteristic empty smile. "Creating perfect hunting grounds. Each blackout zone becomes a little pocket of the old world, before electric lights and security cameras and all the artificial barriers people use to pretend they're safe." His scarred hands gestured toward the computer screens showing grid schematics. 57 minutes of preparation for each zone, 57 minutes to study the patterns, learn who walks alone, who stays late, who thinks darkness is just an inconvenience instead of an opportunity. Batman moved slightly, positioning himself between Zsasz and the stairs. 3 victims so far. You're following some kind of pattern. 3 down, 54 to go, Zsasz confirmed cheerfully. 57 total, 1 for each bell tower in Gotham's original city plan. Each tower was supposed to watch over a specific number of families, you see. The church records are very precise about these things. 57 towers, 57 areas of responsibility, 57 perfect hunting grounds. The madness of it was breathtaking in its scope. Zsasz had researched Gotham's ecclesiastical history, mapped the city's original spiritual geography, and was now using that ancient pattern as a template for modern murder. Each bell tower would serve as a command post for blackout in its historical area of influence. "Alfred," Batman subvocalized. "He's planning 57 murders total. We need to identify all the original bell tower locations, already cross-referencing historical church records with current power grid access points." Alfred replied immediately. "Master Bruce, if his pattern holds, the next blackout should occur in the Merchants' Quarter, centered on the old St. Catherine's Tower. But that's been demolished. The site is now a parking garage." "Parking garage?" Batman looked at Zsasz, who was watching him with amused interest. "Your voice carried," Zsasz noted. "And yes, not all of the original towers still stand. That's what makes this so much more interesting." some hunting grounds need to be created from scratch. He gestured toward a blueprint spread across one of the tables, architectural plans for temporary cell phone towers. Amazing what you can accomplish with the right permits and a believable cover story about improving cellular coverage. The scope of the planning was staggering. Zsasz hadn't just studied Gotham's history, he'd found ways to recreate it, installing his own elevated command posts where the original bell towers no longer existed. Each temporary installation would give him the same tactical advantages as these ancient stone towers. "You won't complete your count," Batman said quietly, moving closer. "Won't I?" Zsasz's empty smile widened. "Look around, Batman. This city is full of people who walk alone in the dark, who stay late at work, who think their routines make them safe. 57 opportunities to prove that safety is just an illusion, that in the end we're all just numbers waiting to be counted." Rain continued pattering against the tower's windows, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across Gotham's skyline. The storm was intensifying, which would make Batman's job both harder and easier. Harder to track movement, but the weather would also drive more people indoors, reducing the number of potential victims on the streets. "Master Bruce." Alfred's voice carried urgent concern. "I'm detecting movement at 3 other bell tower locations. He's not working alone." "Associates?" Batman asked, both aloud and through his communication system. "Hired help," Zsasz confirmed. "Very specific skill sets. Electronics experts who don't ask questions. Urban climbers who can access difficult locations. People who understand that some jobs are about precision rather than passion." His fingers moved across the keyboards again, and in the distance, another section of Gotham went dark. 58 minutes of preparation for the next zone. The counting continues. Batman lunged forward, but Zsasz was already moving, slipping through a window that opened onto the tower's exterior maintenance platform. The killer moved with the confidence of someone who had studied every possible escape route, his scarred hands finding handholds in the ancient stonework that Batman could barely see in the rain-soaked darkness. "He's climbing down the exterior," Batman reported through his cowl. "Alfred, coordinate with GCPD to establish a perimeter, but keep them back. If he has people at other locations, we can't risk him signaling them to accelerate their timeline." "Already contacting Commissioner Gordon," Alfred replied. "But Master Bruce, if he's been planning this for months, he'll have contingencies we haven't considered." Batman followed Zsasz onto the exterior platform, rain immediately soaking through his cape as he tracked the killer's descent down the tower's rain-slicked stones. The climb was treacherous, even with specialized equipment. Doing it in these conditions required either desperation or the kind of methodical fearlessness that came with genuine madness. Zsasz moved like someone who had practiced this exact route dozens of times, finding secure holds even in the dark. But Batman had advantages of his own: better equipment, enhanced vision, and most importantly, years of experience moving through Gotham's vertical landscape in all weather conditions. "You can't stop all of us, Batman," Zsasz called up through the rain. "Even if you catch me, there are already people in position at the next 3 locations. The counting continues whether I'm there to do it personally or not." "Alfred," Batman sub-vocalized as he continued his pursuit, "locate those other positions. If he's got people at 3 more towers, we need to coordinate simultaneous takedowns." "Working on it now," Alfred replied. "I'm also reaching out to Dr. Tompkins. Her psychological profile of Zsasz might help us understand how to disrupt his specific methodical approach." Zsasz reached a ledge about 30 feet above street level and paused, looking up at Batman with that characteristic empty expression. "You know what's beautiful about counting, Batman? It's pure. No emotion, no sentiment, no false hope, just accurate accounting of what is. 57 opportunities to demonstrate that truth. And what happens after 57? Batman asked, continuing his descent while keeping the killer in sight. 58, Zsasz replied simply. The counting never stops. It just finds new parameters, new categories, new ways to keep accurate books. He pulled something from his jacket. Not a weapon, but what appeared to be a remote control device. Like right now. Even talking to you counts as time invested in the project. Every minute we spend on this conversation is 1 minute closer to the next blackout, the next opportunity, the next point scored. Before Batman could react, Zsasz activated the device. Immediately the lights in the surrounding blocks began flickering in a specific pattern. Not random outages, but a coded signal. In the distance, Batman could see similar light patterns appearing across the city as other members of Zsasz's network acknowledged the message. They know to accelerate the timeline now, Zsasz explained conversationally. 3 simultaneous blackouts, 3 simultaneous hunting opportunities. The math becomes more efficient when you parallelize the process. Batman launched a grappling line towards Zsasz's position, but the killer was already moving again, swinging from the ledge to a neighboring building's fire escape with practiced ease. The rain made everything slippery, dangerous, but Zsasz navigated the route like someone who had rehearsed it extensively. Master Bruce, Alfred's voice carried real alarm. Power outages are beginning in 3 separate districts simultaneously. The Merchants' Quarter, the Old Industrial District, and the University area. Each blackout zone encompasses roughly 4 square blocks. Response times? Batman asked. Pursuing Zhangs upon the palace and becoming increasingly treacherous as the storm intensified. GPP is mobilizing, but they're spread thin across 3 locations. And Master Bruce. Dr. Tompkins just arrived at the cave. She says Zsasz's methodical counting behavior suggests he's entered a state of complete emotional detachment. He'll continue following his pattern regardless of consequences to himself or others. Batman could see what she meant. Zet was moving through the dangerous storm conditions without any apparent concern for his own safety, focused entirely on executing his predetermined plan. That single-minded determination made him both predictable and extremely dangerous. Predictable because he would stick to his pattern, dangerous because nothing would deter him from completing it. Tell Dr. Tompkins I need to know how to break his counting pattern, Batman called through the communication system as he leapt from one building to another following Zsasz's route across Gotham's skyline. There has to be something that disrupts his methodical thinking. Zeth had reached another bell tower, this one attached to a more modern church, its architecture less ornate, but its height still commanding a clear view of multiple city blocks. The killer disappeared through a service door, clearly familiar with this building's layout as well. Dr. Tompkins suggests that Zeth's counting serves as a psychological anchor, Alfred reported. Breaking the pattern might require forcing him to confront something that can't be reduced to simple arithmetic, something that represents genuine human complexity rather than numerical abstraction. Batman reached the church and found the service door Zsasz had used. The interior was better maintained than St. Bartholomew's, but still largely empty at this hour. However, as he climbed toward the bell tower, he could hear voices. Not just Zsasz's methodical counting, but someone else, a frightened voice pleading. Please, I don't understand what this is about. I was just walking home from work. I don't have anything valuable. 61, 62, 63. Zsasz's counting continued underneath the other voice, treating the human pleas as background noise to his arithmetic. Batman reached the bell chamber to find Zsasz with a hostage, a young woman in scrubs who had probably been working a late shift at one of the nearby medical facilities. She was bound to one of the bell supports, eyes wide with terror, as Zsasz moved around her with clinical detachment. "Ah, Batman," Zsasz said without looking up from his equipment. "Perfect timing. You can watch the next phase of the count. This one makes 64 when I'm finished with her." "Let her go," Batman said, studying the chamber's layout for tactical options. "Your pattern doesn't require witnesses, doesn't it?" Zsasz finally looked up, his scarred face showing mild interest. "I've been thinking about the original bell towers, Batman. They weren't just for calling people to prayer. They were for marking time, announcing important events, making sure the whole community heard significant news." He gestured toward the hostage. "What's more significant than demonstrating that all those people down there, living their little lives, thinking they matter? What's more significant than proving they're just numbers in someone else's count?" "Master Bruce," Alfred's voice carried urgency. "The other blackout zones. We're getting reports of multiple casualties. His people are working faster than anticipated." Batman moved slowly around the chamber's perimeter, keeping his hands visible while calculating angles and distances. The hostage, her name tag read Sarah, was watching him with desperate hope, but he could see that Zsasz had positioned her where any rescue attempt would be complicated by the bell tower's confined space. "Sarah?" Batman said quietly, making eye contact with the young woman. "I need you to listen to my voice and stay calm. This is going to be over soon." "See, that's the problem with people like you, Batman," Zeth interjected, his counting temporarily paused. "You make promises you can't keep. You tell them everything will be fine when the arithmetic says otherwise. 64 lives taken, and how many more could have been saved if people just accepted the math instead of clinging to false hope?" "The math?" Batman asked, genuinely curious about Zash's reasoning. Sometimes the best way to disrupt a methodical mind was to make it explain its logic. "Simple," Zsasz replied, warming to the subject. "Gotham has roughly 8 million people. Crime statistics show that approximately 2% will be victims of serious violent crime annually. That's 160,000 victims per year, or about 440 per day." He gestured around the bell chamber. "I'm just making the process more efficient, more honest. Instead of pretending those numbers represent abstract statistics, I make them real, personal, accurate." "But you're not preventing those crimes," Batman pointed out. "You're adding to them." "Am I?" Zash's empty smile returned. "Or am I just bringing clarity to a process that was happening anyway? These 57 people would have died violent deaths eventually. Car accidents, domestic violence, random street crime, medical malpractice. I'm simply making their deaths count for something, adding them to a tally that means something." Sarah was listening to this exchange with growing horror, but Batman noticed something else. She was also looking around the bell chamber with the practical eye of someone assessing her situation. Medical training, he realized. She was compartmentalizing her fear and trying to understand her circumstance. "Master Bruce," Alfred whispered through the cowl, "Dr. Tompkins says that Zsasz's mathematical reasoning is a defense mechanism against genuine human connection. If you can force him to see his victims as individuals rather than numbers." "Sarah," Batman said, still maintaining eye contact with the hostage, "tell me about your work." What?" She looked confused, glancing between Batman and "Your work," Batman repeated. "You're wearing scrubs, so you work in healthcare. Tell me what you do." I'm a pediatric nurse," Sarah said hesitantly. "At Children's Hospital, I work in the cancer ward." "Irrelevant," Zsasz interjected, but his counting had stopped again. "Occupation doesn't change the arithmetic. How many children have you helped?" Batman asked Sarah, ignoring Zash's eyes. "I don't know," she replied, then seemed to understand what he was asking. Dozens, maybe hundreds over the past 3 years. Kids who were scared, who needed someone to hold their hand during treatments, who just needed someone to listen when they couldn't sleep because they were worried about whether they'd get better. Numbers, Zsasz said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Just different categories in the count. What about the parents? Batman continued. The families who were terrified of losing their children. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued, and Batman noticed that her fear was transforming into something else. Professional confidence mixed with genuine compassion. Every family is different. Mrs. Chen, whose daughter had leukemia, she used to bring homemade soup for the whole staff because she said we were taking better care of her child than she could. She learned to make it from her grandmother's recipe, and every Tuesday for 8 months, she'd show up with enough for 20 people because she said kindness was contagious if you shared it properly. She paused, looking directly at Zsasz, who had stopped counting but was staring at her with growing confusion. Monsieur Rodriguez learned to play guitar specifically for his son during chemotherapy. He'd never played an instrument before, but he practiced for hours every night after work because Carlos loved music, and the treatments made him too sick to enjoy anything else. By the time Carlos went into remission, his father could play 30 songs by heart. Batman could see the effect Sarah's detailed stories were having on Zsasz. The killer's methodical demeanor was beginning to crack as he confronted descriptions of human behavior that couldn't be reduced to simple calculations. Each story contained layers of motivation, emotion, and connection that his arithmetic couldn't process. The Johnson family started their support group after their daughter Rebecca finished treatment, Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. But it wasn't just for other parents. They included siblings, grandparents, even the family pets. Because Rebecca had noticed that her little brother felt left out when everyone focused on her illness, and her grandfather felt helpless because he couldn't fix what was wrong. So they created a space where everyone affected by childhood cancer could share their fears and hopes together. Stop, Zsasz said again, but his voice lacked conviction. His hands moved restlessly, as if trying to find something to count. But Sarah's stories were too complex for simple tallies. Dr. Tompkins is monitoring through the audio feed, Alfred reported quietly. She says Zsasz's psychological defenses are breaking down. His counting mechanism can't process narratives that involve multiple interconnected relationships and ongoing emotional growth. Batman used Zsasz's distraction to move slightly closer, but he was careful not to make any sudden movements that might trigger a violent response. Instead, he encouraged Sarah to continue sharing her experiences. Tell him about the support network the family's created, Batman suggested. Sarah nodded, understanding intuitively what he was trying to accomplish. They didn't just meet once a week for an hour. They became like an extended family. When one child was having a difficult treatment day, other families would bring meals, help with transportation, watch siblings. When Rebecca's hair started growing back, Mrs. Patterson, whose son was just beginning treatment, asked if Rebecca would visit him because he was scared about losing his hair. These aren't numbers, Zsasz protested, but his voice was weaker now. They're complications that don't change the final count. Are they? Sarah asked. Because Rebecca did visit Jeremy Patterson, and she brought photo albums showing how her hair grew back, and she taught him how to tie scarves in cool patterns, and Jeremy started helping other kids who were scared about hair loss, and those kids started an art project making hats for new patients. and the art project got local high school students involved as volunteers, and those volunteers started a scholarship fund for families who couldn't afford parking at the hospital during long treatment stays. Batman watched as Zsasz' face cycled through expressions of confusion, frustration, and something that might have been wonder. The killer who reduced everything to simple arithmetic was confronting a chain of human connections that grew more complex rather than simpler over time. "How do you count that network?" Batman asked gently. Same girl's recovery became a support system for dozens of other families. "Where does that appear in your mathematics? 65, 66, 67? Zsasz started counting again, but the numbers sounded forced, like he was trying to drown out Sarah's words. "And the children themselves?" Batman prompted. "Each one is different," Sarah said, her voice gaining conviction as she spoke. "Emma, who's 7 and wants to be a veterinarian because she says animals don't judge you for being bald. Marcus, who's 13 and writes poetry about what it feels like to be brave when you're really scared. Little Amy, who's only 4 but always shares her toys with kids who are having bad days." "Stop," Zsasz said, his hands moving toward his equipment. "This doesn't change the math." "Doesn't it?" Batman asked. "You said Gotham has 8 million people, but you're talking about them like they're all identical units. Sarah just described individuals, people with names, stories, connections to other people. How do you count that complexity? 68? 69? 70? Zsasz said louder, but Batman could see confusion creeping into his empty expression. "Master Bruce," Alfred said quietly. His psychological profile suggests he uses counting to avoid processing emotional complexity. "You're forcing him to confront exactly what his defense mechanism is designed to avoid." Batman continued his slow movement around the chamber, while Sarah kept talking, describing more of the children she'd cared for, their families, their fears and hopes and individual quirks. With each story, Zsasz's counting became more agitated, less precise. "How do you count hope?" Batman asked. "Emma's dream of becoming a veterinarian, is that a positive number or negative? Marcus's poetry about courage, where does that fit in your arithmetic?" "It doesn't matter," Zsasz insisted, but he'd stopped counting entirely now. "They're all going to die anyway. All of them, the children, their parents, their dreams. None of it matters, because the final count is always the same. 0. "Is it?" Sarah asked, speaking directly to Zsasz for the first time, because Emma's been in remission for 6 months now. And Marcus just got accepted to a creative writing program. And Amy hugged me yesterday and told me I was her favorite grown-up. How do you count that?" Zsasz stared at her, his scarred face showing an expression Batman had never seen before. Uncertainty. The methodical killer who reduced everything to simple arithmetic was confronting something that couldn't be quantified, couldn't be reduced to marks on skin or numbers in a ledger. "The bells," Zsasz said suddenly, looking up at the massive bronze instruments hanging above them. "The bells used to count for the whole city. Hours, celebrations, warnings, deaths. They kept the count when people couldn't." But they weren't just counting, Batman realized. They were communicating. Telling people about weddings, births, festivals, moments of joy as well as sorrow. For the first time since Batman had known him, Zsasz looked genuinely lost. His hands moved toward his carved tallies, touching the scars as if counting them, but the gesture seemed automatic rather than purposeful. "Master Bruce," Alfred's voice was barely audible. "The other locations. GCPD has successfully apprehended his associates. The blackouts are ending." Batman used Zsasz's momentary confusion to move closer, but instead of attacking, he began working on Sarah's restraints. "Your count was never accurate," he told Zsasz quietly. You were only tracking endings, never beginnings, never the moments that make people more than just numbers. But the math, Zeth protested weakly. The math was incomplete, Sarah said as Batman freed her hands. In medicine, we don't just count deaths. We count recoveries, successful treatments, years of life saved, families kept together. Your arithmetic was missing half the equation. Zeth looked around the bell chamber as if seeing it for the first time. The storm outside was beginning to pass, and moonlight was filtering through the windows, illuminating the ancient bells with silver light. For a moment, the killer seemed to hear something in their silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of all the sounds they had once made, all the communications they had carried across centuries of human joy and sorrow. I don't know how to count that, he admitted finally, his voice small and lost. Then maybe it's time to stop counting, Batman said, gently. When GCPD finally arrived to take Zethers into custody, they found him sitting quietly among the bells, no longer carving new tallies into his skin, no longer reducing the world to simple arithmetic. The killer who had terrorized Gotham with methodical madness had encountered something his mathematics couldn't quantify: the irreducible complexity of human connection. Officer Chen, who had remained at the perimeter during the confrontation, approached Batman as the suspect was being loaded into a police transport. Detective Morrison wants a full report, she said, her voice steadier now that the immediate danger had passed. But Batman, what you did up there, getting him to stop counting, how did you know that would work? I didn't, Batman admitted, but sometimes the best way to defeat systematic thinking is to confront it with something genuinely unsystematic. Human connections, genuine emotions, stories that can't be reduced to data points. Chen nodded thoughtfully. The training academy teaches us to look for patterns in criminal behavior, but they also warn us about criminals who've reduced people to patterns themselves. Zsasz was treating victims like entries in a ledger. And now? Batman asked. Now, he'll have to confront the fact that every entry in his ledger was a complete person, with relationships, dreams, fears, hopes. That's going to be harder mathematics for him to process. Sarah emerged from the bell tower supported by MMTs, but she insisted on speaking with Batman before being taken to the hospital for observation. I wanted to thank you, she said. Not just for rescuing me, but for understanding what I was trying to do when I started talking about the families. You recognized that his counting was a psychological defense mechanism, Batman observed. Your medical training helped you see what needed to be disrupted. Pediatric nursing teaches you that every patient is part of a larger system, Sarah explained. You can't treat a child's illness without understanding their family dynamics, their emotional needs, their social connections. When I heard him reducing people to numbers, I knew the only way to fight that was to show him how impossibly complex each person actually is. Batman watched as she was helped into an ambulance, struck by how her professional experience had provided exactly the tools needed to break Zsasz's psychological pattern. In treating sick children, she had learned to see the full humanity in each patient, precisely what Zeb's methodology was designed to avoid. Master Bruce, Alfred's voice came through the cowl as the emergency vehicles departed. I finished analyzing the electronic equipment Zsasz left behind. His network was even more sophisticated than we realized. He had detailed psychological profiles of potential victims, predictive models for their behavior patterns, even algorithmic calculations for optimal timing of each attack. All of it designed to reduce human behavior to predictable data, Batman replied, looking up at the bell tower where Zsasz had conducted his mechanical planning. But he never accounted for the variables that can't be predicted, the choices people make because of love, compassion, connection to others. Indeed. His mathematical models were quite elegant, but they were based on the assumption that human beings act in isolation, making decisions based purely on self-interest and predictable psychological patterns. He never calculated for the possibility that a nurse would risk her own safety to talk a killer out of his delusions because she couldn't stand to see people reduced to numbers. Batman began his journey back across Gotham's rooftops, the storm finally clearing to reveal a sky full of stars. The city's lights stretched out below him, each window representing lives that were far more complex than any mathematical equation could capture. "Alfred," he said as he moved through the urban landscape, "add a note to Zsasz' file. His psychological profile should emphasize that his counting compulsion serves as a defense against emotional complexity. Any future containment or treatment protocols should focus on gradually reintroducing him to the kind of human connections he's been trying to avoid. Rather than trying to suppress his methodical tendencies, help him apply them to understanding positive human connections instead of cataloging negative ones. Exactly. If he's going to count something, let him count acts of kindness, moments of connection, instances of people choosing compassion over self-interest. Let him discover that those numbers add up to something much larger than his previous arithmetic." Days later, Batman stood in the Batcave as Alfred compiled the final reports on what the media had dubbed the Bell Tower conspiracy. The scope of Zsasz's network had been even more extensive than initially realized. 9 separate locations across Gotham, each chosen for its historical significance and tactical advantages, each equipped with sophisticated electronics for coordinating blackouts and monitoring potential victims. The psychiatric evaluation suggests that Zsasz spent over a year planning this operation, Alfred reported, reviewing files on multiple computer screens. His preparation was extraordinarily thorough. He studied not just the architecture of Gotham's original bell towers, but the social patterns of the neighborhoods they once served, the demographic data of potential victims, even the psychological profiles of law enforcement officers who might respond to incidents in each area. Batman studied the network diagram Alfred had created, showing how each bell tower location was connected to the others through electronic communications and shared tactical planning. He turned the city's own infrastructure into a weapon. The power grid, the cellular networks, even the historical architecture, all of it became part of his systematic approach to murder. But there's something quite remarkable in the psychiatric reports, Alfred continued, pulling up a different file. Dr. Tompkins has been working with him since his arrest, and she says his obsession with counting hasn't disappeared. Instead, it's been redirected. How? He's begun keeping track of positive interactions between hospital staff members. Numbers of times nurses help each other with difficult patients. Instances of doctors staying late to comfort worried families. Occasions when security guards go out of their way to help lost visitors find their destination. Alfred's voice carried a note of wonder. His methodical mind is still active, but now it's cataloging acts of kindness instead of opportunities for violence. Batman felt a cautious optimism at this news. Sarah's intervention worked better than we hoped. Indeed. According to Dr. Tompkins, when Zsasz realized that human connections create exponentially complex networks of positive interaction, he became fascinated by trying to map those networks instead of disrupting them. His counting compulsion found a new target, one that reveals growth and connection, rather than reduction and isolation. The reports also detailed the aftermath of Zsasz's network dismantling. His associates, mostly hired specialists with technical skills rather than committed followers, had been arrested without significant resistance once their central coordination system was disrupted. None of them had fully understood the scope of what they were helping to create. having been told they were participating in an elaborate urban planning survey rather than a murder conspiracy. The electronic equipment he installed in the bell towers, Batman noted, "What's been done with it?" "An interesting development there," Alfred replied with what sounded like satisfaction. "James Henderson, the caretaker for St. Bartholomew's, has been working with the city's Historical Preservation Society to repurpose some of the equipment for legitimate bell tower restoration projects. They're using Zsasz's communications network to coordinate efforts to bring several of Gotham's original church bells back into service." Batman looked up from the reports, intrigued. "They're making music instead of coordinating murder." "Precisely. And there's more. The Children's Hospital where Sarah works has received a substantial anonymous donation to expand their family support programs. The donor specifically requested that the funds be used to help families build the kind of connections that, quote, can't be reduced to simple arithmetic. A nominous donation from a Gotham philanthropist who was apparently inspired by news reports of how a pediatric nurse helped resolve a hostage situation by demonstrating the complexity of human compassion, Alfred replied with a slight smile in his voice. "I believe you know this philanthropist quite well." Batman nodded, pleased that some good had emerged from the confrontation with Zsasz, but he was also aware that the killer's systematic approach had revealed something troubling about Gotham itself. How vulnerable the city's infrastructure was to someone with sufficient planning and technical knowledge. "We need to work with the city to improve security around critical infrastructure," he said. "Power grids, communications networks, historical buildings that could be used as tactical positions. Zsasz won't be the last person to try weaponizing the city's own systems." "Already begun," Alfred assured him. "I've been consulting with city planners and security specialists, ostensibly on behalf of Wayne Enterprises' urban development initiatives. We're implementing redundant safeguards and monitoring systems that should prevent anyone from gaining the kind of systematic control Zsasz achieved. And the bell towers themselves, that's perhaps the most encouraging development. The restoration project has generated significant community interest. Churches that have been struggling to maintain their historic bell towers are finding volunteers and financial support. The towers that Zsasz tried to turn into instruments of death are becoming symbols of community resilience instead." 57 bell towers, Alfred mused, reviewing the historical documents they'd recovered. He'd researched every single one, mapped their areas of influence, planned murders that would have taken months to complete. But he never understood what they really represented, Batman replied. Demon weren't just counting markers, they were communication tools, ways for communities to share important moments, both tragic and joyful. "Rather like our own work," Alfred observed quietly. "We spend so much time focused on preventing tragedies that we sometimes forget to count the victories." Batman nodded, looking out over Gotham's skyline where lights twinkled in windows representing millions of individual lives. People like Sarah going about their daily work of caring for others, creating connections that couldn't be reduced to simple numbers. The city's original bell towers might be silent now, but the communication they had once facilitated continued in countless other forms. "Master Bruce," Alfred said after a moment, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding incomplete mathematics. Perhaps we should keep our own tally, not just of crimes prevented, but of lives genuinely improved, connections preserved, moments of hope created." "A different kind of counting," Batman agreed. "One that acknowledges complexity rather than reducing it." In the distance, thunder rolled gently across Gotham, but this time it sounded less like a threat and more like the city's own deep voice, carrying messages of resilience and renewal across its ancient rooftops and modern streets. The bell towers might be silent, but Gotham itself continued to speak, in the voices of nurses caring for sick children, in the footsteps of police officers walking their beats, in the quiet determination of those who chose to build rather than destroy. The counting continued, but now it included more than endings. It encompassed beginnings, connections, hopes, and the infinite complexity of lives lived fully rather than reduced to mere arithmetic. In Gotham's vast equation, every individual story mattered. Every act of compassion counted, and the final sum was always more than the simple addition of its parts. As the storm passed and dawn approached, Batman prepared to return to his own counting, not of defeats inflicted or victories achieved, but of the countless small moments that made the city's equation balance toward hope rather than despair. The morning light was beginning to filter through Gotham's skyline, illuminating bell towers, both ancient and newly restored, each one representing not just architectural heritage, but the human connections that had built and maintained them across generations. He thought about Sarah, who would return to work in a few days, continuing her care for sick children and their families. Her stories had broken through Zsasz's systematic thinking, not because they were exceptionally dramatic, but because they revealed the ordinary complexity of human compassion. Parents learning new skills to comfort their children, strangers becoming friends through shared challenges, small acts of kindness rippling outward in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled. "Master Bruce," Alfred said quietly, "there's one more thing about the bell towers that I think you should know. The restoration project has uncovered something quite remarkable in several of the churches." "What kind of something?" "Hidden archives, documents, letters, records that were sealed away decades ago during various renovations. Personal testimonies from parishioners about how the bell towers helped them through difficult times. Stories of people who heard the bells during moments of crisis and found comfort in knowing they weren't alone in the city. Batman considered this as he looked out over Gotham's awakening streets. The idea that these towers had always served as more than just architectural features, that they had been sources of connection and comfort for people facing their own dark moments, seemed fitting given recent events. "Ten letter in particular," Alfred continued, "written in 1943 by a woman whose husband was killed in the war. She wrote about how the evening bells helped her realize that her grief was part of a larger community of people who had experienced loss, and that the towers were calling not just to summon people to prayer, but to remind them that they were part of something bigger than their individual sorrows." "Community mathematics," Batman said softly. "Addition instead of subtraction, indeed. And Master Bruce, I've been thinking about our own work in those terms. Every night you go out into Gotham, you're not just preventing crimes or stopping criminals, you're maintaining connections between people who might otherwise feel abandoned, between communities that might otherwise fragment, between hope and despair." Batman nodded, understanding what Alfred was suggesting. His mission in Gotham had always been about more than crime fighting. It was about preserving the social fabric that held the city together, protecting the invisible networks of trust and mutual support that made urban life possible. The bell towers were communication devices, he reflected. They helped people coordinate their activities, mark important moments, call for help when needed. In some ways, that's what we do too. We help the city communicate with itself, respond to crises, maintain the connections that keep it functioning. And like those original bell ringers, we serve something larger than ourselves, Alfred added. The towers didn't ring for the glory of the person pulling the ropes. They rang because the community needed to hear from them. As full daylight spread across Gotham, Batman could see people beginning their daily routines. Commuters heading to work, children walking to school, shopkeepers opening their businesses. Each person was part of countless interconnected networks of relationship and responsibility, creating an urban ecosystem too complex for any mathematical model to fully capture. In the distance, he could hear the first test rings from St. Bartholomew's newly restored bells, their deep bronze voices carrying across the city with a sound that was both ancient and immediate. Other towers would follow as the restoration project continued, until Gotham's sky would once again be filled with the kind of purposeful communication that had once helped previous generations navigate their own challenges and celebrations. The final count, Batman said as he prepared to return to Wayne Manor, isn't about adding up victories and defeats. It's about maintaining the connections that make counting itself meaningful. Rather like faith, Alfred observed. Most powerful not when it's calculating advantage, but when it's simply maintaining presence, being available when needed, ringing out across the darkness to let people know they're not alone. And so our tale of Gotham comes to an end. Let the gentle night embrace you as you drift toward peaceful dreams, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, the Dark Knight watches over his city. If you're not asleep yet, we will now play the ambience of Gotham City at night to help you fall asleep. And if you were just listening to our tales, we will see you next time. Good night and sleep well.